The most controversial Minecraft update in history was 1.9, entirely changing PvP mechanics, one of the most loved and popular elements of the game at the time. 8 years later, and there are still players who refuse to play any Minecraft version after 1.8, with some of the most popular Minecraft servers in existence still running on 1.8. Clearly, the combat change was divisive. In fact, ironically, Java is the only version which received the combat update, with Bedrock, Minecraft's most popular edition, never receiving most 1.9 changes. Clearly, something was wrong, as even Mojang didn't want to bring 1.9 combat to Bedrock. And after many years of backlash and discussion from a large portion of the player base, Jeb began to realize that something would have to be done. February the 8th, 2019, he tweeted combat mechanics. A vague statement. A few hours later on the same day, he would tweet that he was watching jitter clicking tutorials, which, for those of you unaware, is a specific technique or method of clicking quickly in 1.8 combat. He also mentions Java and Bedrock need to have the same combat system in the future, as their long-term goal is version parity, and having different combat systems is clearly problematic for game balance. A few months later, in July of 2019, Jeb would post to the official Minecraft subreddit, announcing a new custom Java edition snapshot he was working on to test new combat mechanics. This was well received, as players were finally happy that Mojang was acknowledging and looking into fixing PvP. Well, most players anyways. TheMisterEpic from 3 years ago, not so much. But this was a good sign. Jeb clearly understood players' frustrations, and over the course of a year, he would release 9 combat test snapshots, and the future of combat was looking bright. However, the last combat snapshot was released in August of 2020, and now almost 2 years later, we haven't received one since. So what happened to Minecraft's combat update? Is it cancelled? To understand that, we need to look at what's changed. What's changed, just like your subscription status to me, which you now should have changed to subscribed. Jitter click that sub button and help me hit 500k by the end of the year. No pressure. Anyways, there were many changes throughout the year the combat tests were being released, so we'll look at the newest snapshot, Combat Test 8C, and its core changes. The first major change is attack reach, being a new element of combat and the game overall. Previously, the vanilla Minecraft attack reach was 3 blocks, meaning you could only hit entities at a maximum distance of 3 blocks, no matter what weapon or item you used. The combat snapshot changed this, and while swords still have an attack range of 3 blocks, the default range is now 2.5, with hoes and tridents having a reach of 3.5, the longest of any melee weapon or tool. But there's another mechanic that influences reach, and that's charged attacks. Just like in 1.9 combat, you are rewarded with a bonus by attacking at a timed interval. The key difference now is that in the combat snapshots, a charged attack doesn't deal more damage, but instead gives you increased reach. So while your reach with a sword is normally 3 blocks, if you perform a charged attack, it's 4. Same goes for the axe and trident, which also have an increased range of 1 block when performing a charged attack. Furthermore, you can now do a critical attack while sprinting and jumping, instead of having to stop and jump as it is now in vanilla. This mechanic can be very useful, as demonstrated in this clip. As for normal attacks, well, the attack speed for swords was increased to 3 or 0.33 seconds, compared to the previous speed of 1.6 or 0.625 seconds. That basically means swords recover quicker after each attack, making them less slow and clunky compared to 1.9. You can also now hold left click to attack, and attacking with a non-fully charged sword is now viable, as instead of dealing next to no damage, you just have a reach disadvantage instead. This makes the PvP meta a nice mix of charged and non-charged attacks, as we'll get into later. The axe saw similar changes, with its attack speed increased, but also saw damage nerfs across the board. Axes also always disable shields now, and can be enchanted with the Sweeping Edge enchantment. Oh, and speaking of Sweeping Edge and sweeping attacks, the sword no longer has a default sweeping attack, requiring the Sweeping Edge enchantment to do so now. Axes also gained a new enchantment called Cleaving, which increases damage and also increases the amount of time shields are stunned or deactivated for. Speaking of shields, besides being disabled 100% of the time by axes, they also automatically activate upon sneaking. This means that if you sneak, you can block with a shield and attack at the same time, something which isn't possible in normal vanilla Minecraft. In combat test snapshots, shields are actually stronger than 1.9 due to the fact that their downtime is significantly shorter than it is in current vanilla, where shields can be disabled for up to 5 seconds. The trident is much more useful in the combat snapshots as well, as it has an increased attack speed and reach, although deals slightly less damage. Then we have a variety of other changes. Normal potions can be stacked up to 16, bows become less accurate if drawn for longer than 3 seconds, and crossbows are stronger as the player and mob invulnerability timer is no longer triggered by projectiles, which means multiple arrows can hit and do damage to the same entity at the same time. Eating and drinking also functions differently, as they now can be interrupted by being attacked, although liquids are consumed faster. Oh, and attacking with a fist now deals 1 heart of damage instead of half a heart. So as you can see, combat has become faster paced again, and while elements of 1.9 combat, such as charged attacks, are still present, there is now a closer resemblance to 1.8 combat overall. Clearly Jeb is trying to meet in the middle with the combat changes, finding a nice balance between 1.8 and 1.9. Overall, the changes were a step in the right direction, and communities centered around them began popping up, consisting of 1.9 and 1.8 combat players together. The Combat Test Snapshot community, or CTS for short, was founded by a player called Rice Cookie, who created a server called Combat Reforged featuring kit PvP and FFA game modes. This wasn't the very first PvP server to utilize the Combat Snapshots, as popular German server GommeHD did temporarily run a Combat Snapshot server as well, but Combat Reforged was the first server that was well made and thoroughly designed. The Combat Reforged community was small at the time, primarily consisting of Cookie and his friends, yet would still manage to get the attention of Jeb. Cookie would publicly tweet at Jeb, mentioning some changes he would like to see, and Jeb would privately contact Cookie, even giving him early access to Combat Snapshots to test and play around with before the public could get their hands on them. In fact, you may notice that after Combat Test 7C, the next public snapshot released was 8B. Cookie was actually given access to Combat Test 8A privately by Jeb, an unreleased version of the game which contained the bedrock bridging mechanic. Cookie advised against this mechanic's inclusion, and Jeb would agree, even mentioning that this mechanic may be added in the future under the control of a game rule. So, in the future, we may see bedrock-like bridging in Java. Cookie also got access to other private versions including Combat Test 7A and 7B, so while the community may have been small, they had lots of influence in the development of the later Combat Snapshots. A few YouTubers would make videos discussing the Combat Snapshots and the Combat Reforged community, which sparked the community's growth and development, allowing their Discord and server to grow. One in particular by a PvP YouTuber named Mine Manor racked up over 250,000 views and brought in a wave of new players which populate the server today, even gaining Jeb's attention. These days there exists a handful of servers running the latest Combat Snapshot. First, there's combatereforged.com, a European-based server which features Skywars, FFA, One in the Quiver, and Jules. This server was the original one run by Cookie, but Cookie moved on and passed the project down to another player called Shrobby, who renamed the server Vinade. Combatenhanced.fun is another server running the Combat Snapshot, which also features FFA, as well as Bed Wars, which was very fun to play. So, what is the new combat actually like when playing against skilled players? Well, luckily for me, the friendly community decided to give me the real combat test experience, and let me say, it's quite tough at first. The current PvP meta when shields aren't involved consists of a mix of charged and non-charged attacks. The main strategy is called a parry combo, whereby a player initially attacks with 2 fast hits to knock the opponent away, and then follows up with a sprint jumping fully charged critical attack. When successful and timed correctly, this can allow you to get your opponents in a loop whereby they struggle to stay close enough to reach and hit you, quite similar to how combos work in 1.8. As you can see, I can't do this yet. So I got absolutely destroyed by most of the experienced players here. Tridents can also be used in a similar way fishing rods are used in 1.8 PvP to stop your opponent's momentum, and honestly, are surprisingly fun and satisfying to throw. Crossbows also have a similar function. As for shields, well, shield combat is not as popular. As explained to me by the CTS community, shields are one of the most disliked features of the Combat Snapshots and are quite clunky, confusing, and unenjoyable to use in their current state. General strategies involve just trying to block as much damage as possible and get more crits on your opponent. Overall, as a player who prefers 1.8 combat over 1.9, I quite enjoyed the Combat Snapshots, more than 1.9 combat, that's for sure, and I advise all of you out there to check out the servers and see what it's like for yourself. It can be a bit challenging at first, but after about 30 minutes of playing, I began to get more comfortable with it, and it's quite intuitive. I've linked the IPs, Discords, and combat test snapshots down below. So, clearly there is a community who enjoys the new combat. Many players have asked for changes for years, and Jeb was taking steps in the right direction. So why haven't we had a new snapshot in almost 2 years now? Well, the likely explanation is due to 1.17. The last Combat Snapshot was released shortly after 1.16's release, and with 1.17 being a big update that had a bunch of issues with the update being split, features being delayed, and more, it's likely Jeb directed most of his efforts towards that, putting the Combat Snapshots on the shelf for the time being. That being said, now with 1.19 having released and the majority of the Caves and Cliffs features already rolled out, many CTS community members worry that it could be some time before more work is done. Jeb is still aware of the community and is actively interested in it. Official word from King B Dogs on Twitter mentioned that combat is still going to be updated in the future. But with all the issues surrounding 1.19's cancelled or delayed features, and with 1.20 likely being a big update that would take up most of Jeb and the team's resources, it could still be some time before we see any new developments in the combat snapshots. As it stands now, the last combat snapshot is still running 1.16, 3 versions behind. Mojang have stated that their goal with the combat snapshots is to balance PvP and PvE, as well as having a system of combat which Bedrock and Java share instead of being stuck on different systems. But how much longer will the Minecraft community have to wait to see a less controversial system of PvP? I guess only time will tell. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Special thanks to all the members of the CTS community for sharing info with me, as well as hopping on the server to embarrass me. Be sure to check them out. If you want to play the combat snapshots, I've linked an easy guide to installing it below. Be sure to check out the servers as well. Thank you all so much for watching.